Okay. So let's have a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the ability to meet. Thank you that we still feel a relative safety to be able to come together. Thank you for the other ways that people can meet at this point through internet and still having some way to communicate with each other. We just pray for your direction tonight, for your guidance, for the right words to be spoken, and for those to affect both our minds and our heart in a way that's pleasing to you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay. Now, we stopped last week, if you remember, at what may seem like an odd place, and that's verse 20 of chapter 2. And I told you that I thought that 21 through 23 and then the next chapter had more to do with each other as a section. So let's cover 21 through 23 first, and then we'll move on into chapter 3. So going back to chapter 2, verse 21, in those days while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. And that's not the book of Chronicles that we have. It's the Persian book of Chronicles, which chronicled all of the edicts and policies and decisions under Persian law. So we see how that for whatever reason, and we're not told how exactly, but we see that Mordecai is upgraded. Okay, he's now sitting in the king's gate, where obviously official business is being transacted for the kingdom, in the king's behalf, etc. And of course, he hears of these two, what I think we could call security officers that are plotting to assassinate Xerxes. Now, as I think I've mentioned to you before, this probably is not paranoia on the part of Xerxes, since in the approximately 20th year of his reign, he gets assassinated. So I guess he does have some reason to believe there could be a plot against him, because ultimately there is a plot against him. So he hears this, and he relays this information to Esther, of course, who's now queen, and the king is informed. The plot obviously is foiled from happening, and Mordecai is given credit by Esther, apparently, for giving this information, though it seems to be that it's overlooked in relationship to any sense of reward. There's nothing really mentioned that he gets promoted further or he gets a big banquet and is... Yeah, I mean, now the one thing we could see here, if you wanted to turn from Esther 3, or end of 2, if you go over to Esther 6, you do see a historical document that is mentioned here, and starting at verse 1, it says, during the night the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the books of the Chronicles. Do you see now what it's about? Okay, and they were read before the king, and it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on the king. And of course the king says what dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this. And of course the answer is nothing has yet been done for him. So later on, they realized that they kind of missed the ball here, and they didn't reward Mordecai for what he did. So the king realizes later, as it's recorded here in chapter 6, that he is the one that has caused this to be, and that he has a certain thankfulness that he kind of owes Mordecai because of this. Now it says back here in in chapter 2, verse 23, it says that an inquiry is made. In other words, there's apparently a trial, there's testimony given, and of course it's found out that that these two guys are guilty indeed, and it says that they are, quote, hanged. This is somewhat of a misleading word in English. It's the word talah in Hebrew, and it doesn't mean to be put on a gallows with a rope around your throat. That's not what it means. The word talah means to be impaled. Okay, it was the tradition of not only the Persians, but certainly commonly the Persians. Matter of fact, Darius one time is unhappy with people, and he decides to impale 3,000 people at the same time. Okay, Herodotus tells us about this. So these guys are also impaled, and of course die as a result of being impaled. Now, what we do learn is that even though the Persians used this extensively as a form of capital punishment, the people that really took it up and made it extraordinarily popular in a very grisly way, of course, were the Romans. Okay, and they perfected it in its most gruesome forms, and of course called it crucifixion. It's another system of, in the sense of impaling. So, as a matter of fact, Josephus in his Annals tells us that apparently that the two of the slaves of these two guys that are the security guards at the door are the ones that actually heard of this plot, and they are the ones that go to Mordecai and tell him about it. So we have additional extra biblical information about that. Now, moving on to chapter 3, let's read the first 6 verses and talk about them. It says, after these events, King Xerxes promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established him authority over all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. And so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Verse 3, then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? And in verse 4, now it was when they had spoken daily to him that he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman, now remember, who's telling that he's a Jew? Mordecai. Okay, he's telling it, which of course is really quite interesting, which we'll talk about in a second. Being that on several occasions he tells Esther not to tell that she's a Jew, but now he tells rather publicly that he is. So, verse 5, and when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, and he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they he had been told who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Now, we of course meet this nefarious person the first time we meet him in the story, Haman. And of course somehow, we're not told how, he's raised in his rank all the way even above the 7 princes of Persia, that they must bow down to him. So he almost becomes what we might call the prime minister of Persia at this point. He's obviously become a very powerful person. Now, interestingly, we are again given a lineage here. He's called Hammedatha, the Agagite. And again, as I've always said, and I always encourage you to do, ask the question, why? Because it will lead you to interesting places that otherwise you would not know if you did not ask the question, why? Right. So, I want you to turn first to, hold your place here in Ruth, but I want you to turn back to the book of Numbers, chapter 24. So let's trace down who these Agatites are, as it were. Numbers 24. And we're going to read verses 1 through 8. Numbers 24. This is a story about the frustration of this king named Balak, who hires this, we'll call him secular prophet, he's not a prophet of Israel, named Balaam, and pays him money to give a bad prophecy about Israel. Okay? And he ends up issuing 3 different prophecies about Israel. To the frustration of Balak, none of them are bad prophecies. He wonders, what did I pay for? I want my money back for this one, okay? So let's read this. It says, when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to seek omens, but he set his face towards the wilderness. And Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. It's interesting. He's not really technically a prophet of God. And he took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside the river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be by many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, higher than this person, Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt, that is Israel, obviously. He is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall devour the nations who are his adversaries, and shall crush their bones in pieces and shatter them with his arrows. So we see a mention here of this person, Agag. Well, there's a broader story to this, actually, but let's turn back even further in the Torah to Exodus chapter 17. And here we get a very significant part of this history in this story about who is Agag and who are these Agite kings. That is, the kings of the Amalekites, and that's the group that we're talking about here. So we're going to read here verses 8 through 14 of Exodus 17. So then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, this by the way is the first mention of Joshua here, choose men for us and go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. Then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side, one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, now here's the thing, these next 3 verses are really very interesting, I think. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial, and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. And Moses built an altar and named it, the Lord is my banner. Verse 16, and he said, the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. Now, again, you should ask yourself the question, why? Why does he say that there will be war with Amalek almost perpetually, at least as far as the earth is concerned in the, let's call it first 6,000 years of Earth's history? Why does he say that there's going to be perpetual warfare here? Now, what we see, and what you'll see further, is that this battle was a special satanic strategy to try to wipe Israel out before it could even get going. Remember, they just had gotten released from Egypt. They're going along the road. They've just escaped the Red Sea, and the Amalekites come upon them and try to overwhelm them and destroy them. You have to see Satan's hand is all over this thing as he is trying to do this. Now, we see here that it's a statement by God in verse 16 that the agents or descendants of Amalek will perpetually be used to attack Israel. Okay? Now, I want you to turn, keeping that in mind, I want you to turn to 1 Samuel. Yes, we're going to go to chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. And I want to read this whole section so you get the whole picture here. This is, to say the least, a significant event in the life of Saul. This is a very key event in the life of Saul because of what you're going to read. Okay? So, let's start verse 1 and we'll read verse 23 of 1 Samuel 15. Then Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts." Notice what he's going to tell him prophetically. "I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel." God is not forgetting this whole story about Amalek back in Exodus 17. It's very much on the mind of God, okay? He says, "I'll punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Then Saul summoned the people and numbered them, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek, set an ambush in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, this other group that are not Amalekites, "Go depart from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you too with them, for you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came upon Egypt." So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. In other words, he warns them, get away from here. Verse 7. So Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he captured who? Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and oxen, fatlings, lambs, all that was good, were not willing and were not willingly to destroy them, and they were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless that they were to be utterly destroyed, they did not. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, now notice what Samuel says, seeing this. The Lord tells him to say the following: "I regret that I have made you, O Saul, king, for you have turned back from following me, and you have not carried out my commands." And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night long. And Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and was told to Samuel, saying, "Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, then turned and proceeded on towards Gilgal." And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord, for I have carried out the command of the Lord. I don't think so. Okay? But Samuel said to him, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? In other words, since you were supposed to put everything under the ban, why am I hearing these animals? Okay? And Saul said, notice he says, they have brought them from the Amalekites. For the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we have utterly destroyed. He's lying. Okay? He's lying. Then Samuel said to Saul, Wait, let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, Speak it. Verse 17, and Samuel said, Is it not true, though, you were little in your own eyes, that you were made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed you king over Israel? And the Lord sent you on a mission, and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they have been exterminated. Verse 19, Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but you rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord? Then Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord, and went on the mission on which the Lord sent to me, and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Verse 21, But the people took some of the spoil, okay? Sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Verse 22, And Samuel said, Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination. Now there's a strong statement. For rebellion is as bad as the sin of divination. In other words, sorcery, divination, okay? And insubordination as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So, here we have this event where we see how Saul is soon to be deposed. Why? Because he will not do what he's told. He was not to keep Agag alive at all. It was to kill him as well as everyone else. And of course, to God, this is a horrific point. It's horrific, so horrific that of course he deposes him. And it's horrific, and you're going to see why it's so horrific in just a minute. Now notice what we've learned by studying the lineage of two important people. Haman's ancestors were the Amalekites. And Haman rises to power as what I think, in biblical terminology, would be called the seed of the serpent. Now, why do I call it the seed of the serpent? Because Genesis 3:15 tells us that God will put enmity between the seed of the woman, that is the descendants of Eve, human beings that follow God, and the seed or descendants or lineage, and the word there is Sarah, doesn't mean spiritual descendants of the serpent. It means the biological people that will follow the way of the devil. In other words, and if you notice, if you study Genesis 4, we haven't studied Genesis here, I've taught it before, but in Genesis 4 you have the lineage of the seed of the serpent at that time. You have the followers and the descendants of Cain all the way through, and you see the horrific things that are talked about them until you get down to Lamech, down at the bottom of I think it was about verse 22 or 23 of Genesis 4, and he brags that if Cain killed his 7, then Lamech will kill his 77. He says, even if a boy offends me, I'll kill him. I mean, he brags about his murderous nature. He's proud of it, Okay? He's happy to see people intimidated by him as a bully who kills whoever he wants to kill. This is the seed of the serpent. They don't stop in the end of chapter 4. They go on through history. And people that are used in history, in critical moments in history, against God, against Satan, are in the seed of the serpent. Okay? Nimrod, in chapters 9 and 10, is the seed of the serpent. We go on further. Even, we'll talk about him a little bit later. Back in Daniel's day, he predicts about Antiochus Epiphanes. He's a seed of the serpent. And who is the ultimate seed of the serpent? Who will come? The Antichrist. He's the ultimate seed of the serpent. But there's many, many, many of them. Okay? They all are planted in history at critical times to do the will of Satan. Why? Because Satan is the god of this world. He's the one that got the title deed of the earth when Adam and Eve sinned. He's the one that directs the nations. He's the one that has angelic beings on the top and governing each nation in the world. Okay? It's his world at this point, and he directs the events of it. Well, in this case, it's very directly satanic. Yes.
Tim?
Yes.
Well, Agag was spared, but I know Samuel killed him. But Mrs. Agag must have been spared to have this lineage of Haman.
Well, I think that the truth is that Agag obviously had sons or children, and they were spared, because otherwise we wouldn't have Haman.
Right.
Okay, and that's the whole point. That obviously Agag's children escape because Saul doesn't fulfill the Lord's order. And 500 years later, okay, this comes to fruition when one of his descendants named Haman plots or hatches a plot to do what? To kill all the Jews in Persia. All of them. Okay? This is indeed a satanic plot. Now, look at the other, in the other way. It's also interestingly ironic that David and Solomon spare Shimei. Remember, we studied about him. So he can have a descendant who ultimately, one of his descendants down the line 500 years is named Mordecai. So we have the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman showing up in this event, this very important event that occurs in the book of Esther. Okay? Haman does not plot what he plots for no reason at all. The devil puts him up to it. I guarantee you that he puts him up to it. Now, notice these interesting lineages that weave back and forth over 500 years. Look how this is weaved through the scripture, and we can follow these stories that God puts in here. And as I've said many times before, the Bible is so intriguing, quote unquote, you can't make this stuff up. Okay? I mean, who could have come up with a plot like this and imagined it 500 years before? It's only through the direction of the Holy Spirit that these things could occur, and indeed it does. Okay? Now, these two seeds collide, as I said, at this historic event. Now, it says in verse 2 that Mordecai won't bow down to Haman, as the others will. And, of course, this begins the problem. You know, obviously, you know, it starts with a personal insult from a Haman standpoint. He's offended that he's not being respected the way he thinks. But it grows into a empire-wide problem. The hatred of this man because of Mordecai, and he won't bow down, leads to an empire-wide problem, this plot against the Jews. So, the question, of course, becomes, why might it be that Mordecai won't yield? Why won't he bow down? And let's hold your place here. Or I guess go back from 1 Samuel, and let's go back to Deuteronomy 16. Now, we don't know how good a Torah student Mordecai was. We don't know exactly how much he knew, but let me show you something he might have known, and it might have been part of his reason for why he didn't bow down. And that's Deuteronomy 16, starting in verse 13. I think I wrote that down wrong. I'm sorry. It's not the right reference. At any rate, what I was going to tell you is that it's a quote in Deuteronomy where God tells them that if they bow down in any way to any other person, any other God, that God will destroy them. Their future will not be if they will dare bow down to anyone other than Him. And that, I'm sorry, apparently wrote the place down incorrectly, but so Mordecai may well understand this. He may well understand that this is something that he absolutely shouldn't do. Now, ironically, in verse 4, after several times warning Esther not to reveal she's a Jew, now he reveals in the king's gate that he's a Jew, which I think is fascinating that he does it. And of course, this seems to be really bad timing on his part. And yet again, we're going to see that this is the will of God, that it occurs this way. So in verse 5, we read that Haman is enraged. It's the word bazah in the Hebrew, and it means to be furious, to be extremely upset, to be terribly offended. And the word is found in another interesting place that you might want to turn to, and that's the book of Daniel. And I go there because I think the context is important here. Go to Daniel chapter 11. It's verse 21. It's not translated in the English exactly the way I personally think it should be translated in the Hebrew, but it says, he's speaking of this guy that we've talked about when we taught the book of Daniel, Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember, he is a down the line Persian, in other words, down the lineage of the Persian kings. He, in approximately 175 or so BC, comes into, he goes to war, I believe, against Egypt, if I remember correctly. He doesn't do so well. He comes back, has to go through Israel to go back into the Seleucid area of Persia, the northeastern quadrant up there, the Seleucid area, and decides for a matter of about 10 years that he's just going to persecute the heck out of the Jews, and kills apparently nearly, what we estimate, according to Josephus, nearly 1.5 million Jews. It's a tremendous slaughter at that time. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. It says in verse 21, and in his place a despicable person will rise. That's the word. Okay? Angry, horrid, wretched, okay? Despicable. And I think the fact that the word is found here, just like the word is found about Haman, is not for no reason. Haman is a former version of Antiochus Epiphanes, just like Antichrist will be another version later of Antiochus Epiphanes. They're typologically do similar things. They have a similar mission, etc. Now, Haman realizes, that is, I think it's satanically inspired information, that to kill Mordecai would not be strategic. Satan gives him a far greater plan here in mind than just killing Mordecai. He realizes that if he could set it up correctly, he might be able to effect a kingdom-wide genocide against the Jews. And of course, we see again here the principle that we see so often occurring. And I'll read it to you. You don't necessarily have to turn there. but it occurs time and time again, and it's Deuteronomy 28, verse 37. God says, if you turn away from me, here's what's going to happen. And he lists these terrible curses that will occur to them. And he says, you shall become a horror and a proverb and a taunt among all the people where the Lord will drive you. This is a statement of anti-Semitism. This is exactly what is occurring here with Haman. He's coming up with a massive anti-Semitic plan. Now, Haman conceives the strategy to eliminate Jews. Herodotus tells us that this time in the Persian Empire, which is a huge empire and territory, it's estimated there were 15 million Jews in Persia, in the entire empire. So his strategy is a massive strategy. It's actually, if it were accomplished, would have been the biggest strategy and the greatest genocide against the Jews ever. Okay? And yet, of course, we see the way in which it's foiled. But, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, as you talk about this, I just find this completely fascinating from the perspective of some people have described it as this cosmic chess match
Yes.
between God and Satan. And before the first coming of Christ, Satan, on multiple occasions, as is recorded in the Old Testament, made repeated efforts to completely wipe out the Jews.
Absolutely.
Because if he could accomplish that, Messiah would have never come in the first place, and everybody that was ever created would go to the lake of fire.
Exactly.
And since the first coming of Christ, every attempt to wipe out the Jews since then is designed to prevent Jesus from returning and establishing his kingdom.
Yes.
Because he comes back to the earth as a result of responding to this cry of the remnant nation of Israel, who now believes in the Messiah
Yes.
at the end of the 77,
Mm-hmm.
to rescue them from, ultimate destruction at the hands of the Antichrist.
Yes.
And that's all of human history.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes. You can look at the events of human history as single events, but God gives us a very broad brushstroke of history. And he sets up an understanding. And it all starts in Genesis 3:15. You cannot underestimate that verse. Mm-hmm. It's not only a promise of Messiah, it's a promise of a war. A war. Okay? A perpetual war on the earth that will occur until the return of Messiah ends it. Now, and the things that you see going on in different cultures that have satanic elements are also parts of that war. Okay?
I just read where the New Danish Bible, Bible 2020, they have eliminated every word of Israel.
Oh, really?
And replaced it with the people of the Jews, but it's like they don't deserve a homeland.
Right, exactly.
And it's all replacement theology.
Yes, exactly.
But this is the new Bible coming out.
Yeah. The replacement theology people are going to be really surprised at the second coming of Christ. They're going to go, ooh, we had that wrong, didn't we?
Yeah.
They will be. Now, I don't believe that we can touch this subject without touching another subject. Now, call me a Jewish wannabe, okay? And I am, about 25%, okay? But you can't think about this without thinking of the name Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. Because it's certainly, if he would have succeeded, if Haman would have succeeded, okay, it would have been the biggest culling and killing of the greatest number of Jews on the planet at that time. God made certain it didn't succeed. But there's one who came after him in the spirit of Haman, who made a huge attempt. And I want to read you a few things about it. I feel like I should throw this out from a history standpoint to see this. Of course, we call this in English Hitler's effort at the final solution. The final solution, okay? They called it, I can't pronounce it very well, but it's Endlösung de la Judenfrage, the final solution of the Jews, for the Jews. Now, this, of course, was a Nazi plan for the genocide of Jews during World War II. I'm going to read this to you, okay? It was formulated in procedural and geopolitical terms by the Nazi leadership beginning approximately January of 1942 at the Wannsee Conference held near Berlin. It culminated in what we commonly call the Holocaust, which saw the killing of 90% of all Polish Jews and 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe being wiped out. In 1940, following the fall of France, Eichmann devised the Madagascar Plan to move Europe's Jewish population to the French colony. But the plan was abandoned for logistical reasons, and especially because there was a naval blockade that prevented it. There were also preliminary plans to deport Jews to Palestine and even to Siberia. Okay? In 1941, Raul Hilberg, in the first phase of the mass murder of Jews, wrote concerning this plan about the mobile killing units which began to pursue their victims across occupied eastern territories, and, of course, in a second phase stretching across all German-occupied Europe. The Jewish victims were sent, finally, to death camps, to centralized extermination camps built for the purpose of systematic implementation of the final solution. So the first phase of this plan at this conference was to have mobile killing units where they would come into cities, they would accumulate Jews and kill them there. Then it moved into a grander phase, okay, a worse phase in late 42, where then they came up, we'll talk about it in a minute, for the second phase of this final solution. Now, from gaining power in January of 1933 until the outbreak of the war in September of 39, the Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany was focused on intimidation, expropriating their money, their property, remember this as we go on in tonight's teaching, and also encouraging them to emigrate. The outbreak of the war and the invasion of Poland brought a population of 3.5 million Polish Jews under the control of the Nazi security forces and marked the start of a far more savage persecution, including mass killings. In German-occupied zone of Poland, Jews were forced into hundreds of makeshift ghettos. You've probably heard of the Warsaw Ghetto. There were many ghettos set up for the Jews in many cities, Warsaw being just one of them, pending further arrangements for them. Hitler's top echelon began to pursue Hitler's new anti-Semitic plan to eradicate rather than to expel the Jews. Himmler became the chief architect of this new plan, which came to be called the final solution to the Jewish question. On July 31st, 1941, Göring wrote a letter authorizing him to make, quote, the necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question. In speaking of the extermination of the Jews, it was carried out in two major operations. The onset of the first was the mobile killing units by the SS, okay, in the ordering of all police battalions dispatched to do so. The second, of course, was to gather the Jewish inhabitants of Central, Western, Southern, Eastern Europe, and to gather them together to be transported through Holocaust trains to camps with newly built gassing facilities. Massacres of about 1 million Jews occurred before the plans for the final solution when their final phase, which was implemented in late 1942. But it was only with the decision to annihilate the entire Jewish population that the extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka were fitted with the permanent gas chambers to kill large numbers of Jews in a relatively short period of time. At a conference, an officer named Heydrich indicated that the approximately 11 million Jews in Europe would fall under the provisions of this final solution. The simplest, most decisive way that Heydrich, this policymaker, could ensure the smooth flow of deportations to the death camps was by asserting his total control over the fate of the Jews in the Reich in the East under the single authority of what was called the RSHA. Now, I won't go on, but this, of course, caused the death of at least 6 million Jews in Europe, and also the extermination of another 5 to 6 million people that were non-Jews, people that were considered to be Aryan enough. He also attacked very much the gypsy populations in Europe, in Eastern Europe. He attacked people that were considered to be mentally defective. He attacked people considered to be, the homosexuals were targeted and killed by Hitler also. Many other people were put under this too. But it caused the death of, in total, about 12 million individuals in a several-year period of time. Now, this is in the spirit of Haman. This is when someone did get control of policy, did get control of the means, did get control of the money to accomplish this. And sadly, tragically, indeed, they pulled it off. Now let's read back in Esther. Let's read verses 7 through 15. So in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king, Pur, P-U-R, that is, the lot was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to the king, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of other people, and they don't observe the king's laws. So it's not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is displeasing to the king, if it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to be put into the king's treasuries." Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written, just as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over all the provinces, and to the princes of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to their language, being written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring. And letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, men and children, women and children, in one day. That is the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the peoples, so that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out, impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued in Susa, the capital. Notice this last part. I think it's very interesting. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. All right, now let's go through this. It says that in the first month, of the year, that is the month of Nisan, which would be middle or late April, March, maybe early April, depending on how the moon falls exactly, because it's a lunar calendar. So in the Son of 474 BC, this is the date, okay? This is the 12th year of Xerxes' reign. Haman has this thing cast called the pur, P-U-R. In English, it's often called dice, okay? And what we find, Herodotus tells us that this is a form of fortune-telling which was used widely by Persian officials to pick out or secure certain important dates on the Persian calendar. When should this occur? What's the best time for that occur? When should this policy be enacted? When should we plant? When should we, all these things were decided by the pur. This is, of course, why we have a name for this holiday that comes about because of the Jews being saved, which is called Purim. Purim, that's where it comes from. It's actually a Persian name. Exactly, it's the plural. Okay? Now, so he cast these lots to find the right or ideal date to enact the plot to kill the Jews. Okay? Who do you think he's appealing to in his fortune telling? Satan. Okay? Now, the pur falls on Adar 12. That is, Adar is the last month of the year. Okay? So, approximately 11 months in the future, on Adar 12, is the day that the edict will be enacted, and all the people of Persia are supposed to get a hold of whoever is a Jew and kill them. Okay? So, Haman has a year to plan. But the Jews have a year to plan also. Both is true. Okay? Now, there's an interesting thing. I noticed this quote the other day by Albert Einstein. He says, quote, God does not play the dice. And he does not. If he does play them, they're in his favor. And here they roll the dice, but it doesn't work very well for the roll. Okay? In other words, God allows the roll, in a sense, the plot to be hatched, but turns it for his purposes. Now, Haman obviously appeals to Xerxes', we'll use the modern terminology, xenophobic nature. He stirs up a distrust and hatred of people that are non-Persian, xenophobic. And of course, he selects out these people who have, quote, a different set of laws and different customs that, quote, don't quite fit in with us. That's the whole point. They don't really fit in with us, the Jews. So he sets up or stirs up this intolerance and this prejudice in the land. And of course, it's interesting. I want you to turn, if you hold your place here in Esther, I want you to turn into the New Testament. I want you to turn to 1 John 2. I think we shouldn't miss the New Testament application of what's going on here. 1 John 2. And we're going to look at verse 18. Children, it's the last hour. And just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many antichrists have risen. From this we know that it is the last hour. Haman is clearly one of these antichrist figures. And the plot he's hatching is an antichrist plot. Okay? Now, like Hitler, Haman, of course, proposes this final solution for the Jewish problem. And he proposes that if he's allowed to do this, that he will contribute 10,000 talents of silver to the Persian treasuries. Now let's figure out what that means. A talent of silver was conservatively figured during the Persian era as 75 pounds of silver. Sometimes it was more like 90 pounds, but A medium range would give it approximately 75 pounds, okay? Now, if you take 75 pounds of silver and multiply it times 16 ounces in a pound, okay, and then you multiply that times 10,000 of them, talents, you come up with somewhere between 10 to 12 million ounces of silver. 10 to 12 million ounces. At today's price, at approximately $18 an ounce, that means that he's proposing to put in the treasury approximately $2.16 billion into the treasury of Xerxes. Now, for a man who suffered a terrible loss in a war a few years ago, that has depleted his treasury probably badly, all right, and who's been humiliated, it's estimated by Herodotus states of this amount of money that it was 2/3 of the annual budget of the whole Persian Empire. So he's saying that if he's allowed to do this, will contribute 2/3 of a year's budget to the treasuries of Persia. It's a lot of money he's talking about. So, with this astounding sum of money, the king hands Haman his signet ring, which means that he can make any edict embossed in clay tablets. The signet ring is put into it and it becomes an official Persian law, which cannot be changed. So he hands over the signet ring, and therefore all necessary documents are made. Okay? Now, remember, it's not that Haman owns at this point on his personal assets 10,000, talents of silver. Exactly. It's that he's going to persecute the Jews, rob them of their property, and as a result, they will come up with the equivalent of 10,000 talents of... Have we heard this plot happen before? What is it that Hitler did? Starting in, I think, 36, or maybe a year before 36. Exactly. They started to attack Jewish businesses. They had this, I think it's called the Night of the Broken Glass.
Kristallnacht.
Yeah, is that what it's called? Kristallnacht? Yeah, where they would encourage people to go and break into Jewish businesses. They would take goods, loot them, take all their goods. This happened. They made laws. They made taxes against the Jews. As was said, they stole Jewish artwork. Matter of fact, we saw an interesting, really good, I think, movie last week. My wife and I did. It was on Amazon Movies, called The Monument Guys, The Monument Men. Have you ever seen it?
Heard of it.
No? Yeah, The Monument Men. It's a true story. And it's about George Clooney stars in it, and I think what is it? Who else? There's 4 or 5 famous actors in this thing, but it's a story that towards the end of the war, in the late 43 and early 44, the United States government recognized that the Germans had stolen so much artwork from Europe and stolen so much artwork from German collectors. They'd amassed probably hundreds of millions of dollars of artwork. And they got the information that because Germany was retreating back towards Germany to set up a final stand, that they were planning on, they'd stored it in these well, they didn't know where it was stored. That was the problem. But they got intelligence, they stored them in all these different places. And that at the right time, the artwork was to be torched when Hitler gave the word. I mean, some of the greatest pieces of art ever produced on this planet were all to be torched because Hitler was a madman and didn't want anyone else to have them. So the story is the story about how these guys are commissioned by the U.S. government to infiltrate and to try to figure out where these things were stored and to try to get them. And they did. They found them in salt mines. They find them in abandoned copper mines. They finally found them all over these places, and they had them boxed up and sent back. And actually, many of them, they returned those to the French that were the French. They returned to Belgium those people of Belgium, and et cetera, et cetera. It's an interesting story. It's true. This is exactly what happened. Now, In verse 12, it says the scribes are ordered to produce public documents sent by the postal system, you notice, okay, to the entire empire. And this was to be sent on the 13th day of the first month. That is, the 13th of Nisan. I'm going, that sounds familiar to me. So, turn, if you would, to the 12th chapter of Exodus. Exodus chapter 12. These details are not put in for no reason. They're all, again, like I've told you, a remiz, as the rabbis called them. These secret things, these mystical elements put in that are to be dug out and to be understood. So, it says in verse 2, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. What is that? Nisan. Drop down to verse 6. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to gather to kill, that is, the lambs, at twilight. Okay? Moreover, they shall take some of the blood, put it on the doorposts and on the lintels of the houses in which they eat, etc., etc. So what is the night that the blood is put on before the first day of Passover? The 13th of Nisan. Do you think that's a coincidence? I don't think it's a coincidence. As a matter of fact, I think that this date was picked, ironically, by Haman to send these messages across the kingdom. He thinks it's the death knell of the Jews, but he doesn't realize it's his own death sentence. That's what's going to occur in the story. He just gave his own death sentence to himself by what he just did. It's another remiz.
The backfiring of the plan.
Yeah, the backfiring of the plan. So let's finish out this chapter. In verses 13 and 14, it shows that the empire-wide edicts were issued, the public nature of these edicts, announcing that on this 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, all the Persians should then kill all the Jews that are around them. That says that Xerxes and Haman have a drink, seemingly congratulating themselves for this, quote, brilliant plan. They found a way to fund the government, but it states that, quote, the capital of Susa was in confusion. The word is bukf. It's an interesting word in the Hebrew. It means to be perplexed or disturbed or to be upset, especially in relationship to some type of evil. In other words, it gives you the impression that the people in Susa were not happy with this edict. I can imagine the following. We're not told this, but I think it's probably fair to say. They might be asking questions when they read this edict like, why would the king give us this order? Okay? Or, for instance, I have Jewish friends and I have Jewish clients in my business. Or maybe others. My daughter is married a Jew. What about her and my grandchildren? Or, why should I kill my Jewish neighbor and his wife and all their children? You know, I think that's probably what was going on in the minds of the Persian people this time.
How long had they been living together at that point? A long time, right?
They had been living together since essentially since 586 BC.
Since the deportation.
Right, since the last deportation, and then the night that Cyrus took over from Nebuchadnezzar and conquered Babylon, from that time all of Babylonian territory became Persian territory, and all the Jews that lived anywhere in Babylon were then, in that sense, Persian Jews. So, you know, they'd been living, a considerable period of time together. you have to imagine, because the Jews were secularized, it's pretty clear, there must have been a tremendous amount of intermarriage that was going on over that period of time. So I can imagine that the people of Persia, when they read these, were shocked. They were probably shocked to read it. So
It was more than 70 years because a lot of the people didn't go back.
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, we're in the 5th century BC at this point.
Yes, in the 5th century BC.
It's well over 100 years.
Well over 100 years that this has been going on. So you think of all the intermarrying that goes on in any one culture in 100 years. It's a lot of intermarrying. There's a lot of, quote, mixed race people, as it were. Okay? So, at any rate, that's the end of the 3rd chapter. And we'll see how this great drama works out as we next week take the 4th chapter. Okay? So, again, Michael, will you close us with a word of prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity we've had this evening to study in your word, and for the deeper that we look into it and ask that why question, how much it does open up to us even more. And Lord, we thank you for Tim's research and everything that he does, Father. I pray you bless him, give him strength and a blessing for his efforts, and then help us, Lord, each and every one, God, as we live our lives, Father, each day, that we would keep in mind, Father, that you have a plan for all of our lives, and that you utilize us, Father, in the way that you see fit. And that's what our desire is, to be able to walk in your Spirit and to follow after that. Mm-hmm. So do go with us the remainder of this evening, we pray. Be with each and every one that's joined us this evening. Bless each and every one, their families, and their individual needs. And we'll thank you for it all in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.